Good morning. My name is Tony Meyer, and I'm a member of AJC's Executive Council, and I'm co-chair of the Raymer Institute, which oversees the Berlin office. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a concurrent session focused on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Just last month, about a dozen miles from where we are today, Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authority, declared that the real reason why Nazis carried out the Holocaust was because of Jewish social behaviors. In the United Kingdom, the Jewish community is grappling with blatantly anti-Semitic members of the Labour Party and a party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who can't or won't acknowledge, much less address, the problem. In Berlin, an Israeli Arab who simply wanted to see what it would be like to wear a kippah was beaten and whipped. And in France, an 85-year-old Holocaust survivor, Mireille Knoll, was brutally murdered in her home, becoming the 11th Jew killed in an anti-Semitic attack in France since 2006. In the U.S., the far-right anti-Semitism and neo-Nazism on display in Charlottesville, and the vile remarks made by Louis Farrakhan and his far-left defenders, as well as many worrying incidents on college campuses, have reminded us Americans that even in the United States, there's much work to be done to eradicate anti-Jewish attitudes. Alongside this resurgence of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, which will be discussed today, has gained further traction. Israel is constantly demonized, and its right to exist is continually challenged. In Europe, rallies with burning Israeli flags have become all too common. Some immigrant groups have taken the toxic and false lessons they learned about Jews with them to the streets of Paris, London, Berlin, Amsterdam, and beyond. And protests of Israel are staged outside synagogues, blurring the lines between anti-Semitism, criticism of Israel, and anti-Zionism. The dynamic between these two hatreds continues to raise complicated questions. What is the relationship between them? Should world Jewry seek to address these issues separately, or are they far too intricately connected? And when Israel is criticized, how do we separate what might be legitimate concerns regarding Israeli policies from anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? To discuss these complex and compelling questions and more, we are joined by a distinguished panel, many of whom are good friends of mine. The first introduction is Dore Gold, who is not here yet. He's running late this morning. Israel's ambassador to the United Nations from 1997 to 1999. Gerald Steinbergm, professor of political science at Bar-Ilan University and founder of NGO Monitor. Düzen Tekkal, an independent German journalist and prominent member of the Yazidi community, and founder and current chairwoman of the nonprofit organization Hawar, and my good friend Simone Rodan-Benzaquen, director of AJC Europe. Daniel Schwammenthal, director of AJC's Brussels-based Transatlantic Institute, will moderate the discussion. Daniel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Anti-Zionism the New Anti-Semitism? Yes, let's go east. But we will try to use the next hour or so to delve a little bit more into the topic, to hear very different perspectives, and hopefully also to try to arm ourselves, that we all as individuals have to confront this issue, to arm ourselves with arguments and ways to confront this phenomenon. And I will play a little bit devil's advocate here to make the discussion a little bit more lively, hopefully. So don't please confuse the question strategy with my own opinions. I want to start perhaps not with ladies first, but with Gerald. Almost said Dore.
I can do both.
Had the discussion, they're often confused. Gerald, the new Is that the new anti-Semitism? I'm unfortunately also getting also. I do remember the anti-Zionism, racism resolution, which was luckily revoked with the great help of AJC as well. But is there a new element? And perhaps give us your definition also of what really is anti-Zionism.
As you said, the new elements are not suddenly introduced, but we've seen them in raves. Actually, before 1975, there was the Soviet Union version of the new anti-Semitism, which was mixed between the Zionists. You had the doctor's plot, the Zionists, the Jews. Already in the 50s and 60s, you begin to see some of these elements. 75 UN resolution, after the 73 war, after the oil embargo, made it more blatant. I can't not mention the 2001 Durban conference and the NGO forum, where a lot of the definitions and terms, BDS started there, and what we call lawfare, demonization. So the Zionist element of the new anti-Semitism gradually became much stronger, and it's there now very much in our faces. And I think that phenomenon is obviously very different, although it has mixed elements, from the anti-Semitism of the right of the pre-war period before the Holocaust and 2,000 years or longer of that type of hatred of Jews. The question is, what forms does it take and what do we deal with that? I think I'm going to introduce early on in this the IRA definitions. I think that helps us a lot. The International Holocaust Remembrance Association, which is a framework in which a number of countries take a very active role. It's not an NGO, it's not a popular movement, but it's run by governments. And they've adopted, back in Romania 2 or 3 years ago, a very clear set of definitions, which have also been adopted by a number of countries. The State Department's definition is very similar. And there they talk about singling out Israel, double standards, using unique criteria. All of those terms, I think, are very much evident in this new anti-Semitism, that Israel is treated differently from the 190 other countries in the world, and the criteria that are applied to Israel are very often unique terms. I'll just give you one example, and that is when in the work that we do on NGOs, we've looked at the term collective punishment. It comes back up every time we talk about Gaza. It was in the news again about a month ago. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, they all use the term collective punishment. There's no other country in the world where that, or conflict situation, where that term is used, and it has echoes of the Nazi period. So by combining those elements and using that language, you're singling out Israel. And to me, that is the epitome of the new anti-Semitism.
Simone, we had until, I think it was a year ago, a French prime minister who was really at the forefront of battling this new phenomenon. Can you tell us a little bit about, is there a debate at all in France, and how is this discussion taking place under new President Macron?
So first of all, yes, absolutely. Manuel Valls, the former Prime Minister of France, was really one of the first leaders who I think understood that anti-Zionism was either a new form of anti-Semitism, or that anti-Semitism would hide itself behind a sort of anti-Zionism. President Macron, just when he came to power, gave a speech a couple of months afterwards at the roundup of the Veldiv and said exactly the same thing. He said anti-Zionism is the new form of anti-Semitism. That being said, despite the very strong stances of both leaders, there is very little debate in reality on that issue. And it's outright always rejected, mostly by the left and the far left. Mostly by saying that, returning the argument, by saying that basically any criticism of Israel is trying to be stifled. And that's basically where the debate unfortunately ends. And I want to go back to what Gerald said. I think one of the very important things is the working definition. Is because it allows you to understand when the border is being crossed and when anti-Zionism actually turns into anti-Semitism. one of the things that always startles me is the fact that, that the left is absolutely convinced of the fact, in particular the far left, is absolutely convinced of the fact that they are not being anti-Semitic. I don't know if my friends from the Union of Jewish Students are present here, but Germany is fine as well. But we had an absolutely terrible incident about a month ago, where the office of the Union of Jewish Students at one of the most prestigious universities, at the Sorbonne University, was attacked, was totally destroyed, with tags all over the place, death to the Zionists, death to the Jews, death to Israel. And the Union of Jewish Students, the president of the Union of Students, went to the campus and brought a camera crew with them, and confronted some of the students who were there and who had been committing those acts. And you know, the debate revolved around the fact whether it's anti-Semitic. And those students said to him, "Of course it's not anti-Semitic. We're just criticizing Israel." And this is, I think, where a lot of work needs to be done in trying to get young people to understand that a fundamental border is being crossed, and that their view of what anti-Semitism looked like from the far right, from the neo-Nazis, from the 30s, has fundamentally changed, and that's the art of the anti-Semitism and of anti-Semites, is that the mask is changing with time.
We will get back to this complex about the left, but I want to give an opportunity for Düzen to inject her own experience. You were born in Germany, of Kurdish descent, Yazidi descent. You're an award-winning journalist, an author, and particularly on the work you have done in documenting the Yazidi genocide. Two questions. How is that experience of the Yazidis? How do you see connections to the topic we are discussing today? And then I want to hear a little bit about what you have to say, because you're working also with the immigrant community, many of whom come from the Middle East and come with certain ideas. And I hear a little bit about what you have learned by your engagement with this community.
I think there's a mutual understanding between the Yazidi people and the Jewish people, because we have the fact in common that... Do you hear me? Okay, no, okay. I think there's a mutual understanding... Okay. No? Okay. I think there's a mutual understanding between the Yazidis and the Jewish people because of what happened to them, because they are who they are. So they grow up with the same pictures of enemies. Still today in Germany, they call the Yazidis devil worshippers or devil brides, the women who were in the hands of ISIS till today. And till today, there are over 3,000 women still missed. And I went to Iraq in 2014 as a journalist, but I became overnight a war reporter and a human rights activist because I saw with my own eyes what happened to our people. So maybe this is the second combination, that I just heard from my grandfathers and forefathers what happened to our people. And I think as a daughter from religious minorities, it is like, don't be too loud, be quiet, be careful, we are Yazidis. So this was the kind of how I was born and raised. And when I went there, I saw it with my own eyes, and for me it was clear that I have to document it and that we have to say loud what is happening to us. So therefore, for me, anti-Zionism is a new form of anti-Semitism. And especially in Germany, the people are not allowed to say, I'm an anti-Semit, but they can say, I'm against Israel. But for me, it's the same. Because I think when someone is anti-Semitism, we can talk about values or never again or things like that. So what we experienced, especially in the schools, young kids are against Jewish young girls and beaten them, threatened them, incited them. Or for example, there is a big support between our NGO and the American Jewish Committee in Berlin. And we went to the Israel Tag. And we had a flag, an Israel flag, my sister, and she has 2 daughters, and she went to a public bus, and someone was standing there, He was Arab, and he said, "What are you doing there? Are you stupid?" And it was awful for my sister. And I think this is, of course, a new form, because the fact that a society like Germany becomes more and more religious and ethical, especially from the Middle East, is a new form of anti-Semitism. And we have to talk about that. And I don't see that. I don't see that we are talk about the real problems which are happening. And this is very dangerous, not just for Jewish people and minorities, it is dangerous for democracy, because you lose your belief or faith in the rules of law.
Thank you very much. And at this stage, I want to welcome Dr. Dore Gold to the panel. Thank you very much for being here with us. And why don't we direct the next question to you. We've discussed a little bit about the definition of anti-Zionism, the phenomenon mostly identified on the left. We talked a little bit about, Düzen talked a little bit about what she encountered among much of the Muslim community. Can you talk a little bit about, with your experience in the diplomatic world, in the world of foreign affairs, to what extent, some of these confusion, misperception is also something that you encounter actually in your work, in your past work, in your current work as a diplomat, as an advisor, even when you encounter European diplomats or other foreign leaders?
I'm not sure I'm going to give you what you want, but I'll share with you experiences. Oh, I thought I'm wired up.
Yeah, the wiring up, I think. I think you have to turn one direction.
Give it a shot. Turn one direction.
Yeah, the direction of your mic.
Face the back of the... Do you hear me?
That's another option.
Let's use this. So I was saying that I'm not sure I'm going to give you what you're looking for, but I will try and share with you some experiences that immediately come to mind when you speak about the subject of today. I've been thinking about where the campaign, the new anti-Zionism / anti-Semitism comes from. First of all, the analogy between the two is completely fitting. Anti-Zionism is a new form of anti-Semitism. It's just that the units for discussion are no longer individual Jews, they're whole nations. That's the difference. And Jews, the Jewish state, is entitled to the same treatment that other states have. And when you get into double standards in the international community, that is where you wonder, wait a minute, what's going on here? Why are we being treated differently? And you sense the rise of this new phenomenon. I think that part of the problem our adversaries have, or started out with, if we go back to the period around before the '67 war even, was that if, Raymond Aron used to talk about the century of total war. And total war is the idea that the war that's being waged today is not confined to the battlefield, but goes to cities and population centers, and this is what he was preoccupied with in his writings. I think total war is something else. I think total war is attacking the very legitimacy of the society which you're at war with. And that's what our enemies are doing. But if they have a problem fighting Israel, or they had a problem which they're trying to address, because basically, and this may surprise you, it's a statement that we have made in the past, and I'll make it again. In the international community, Israel is really the most legitimate, internationally legitimate country in the UN system. And the reason I say that is because Israel is the only country whose legitimacy and foundation were recognized by both the League of Nations and the United Nations. Of course, when it was the League of Nations, I'm speaking about the mandate and recognizing the Balfour Declaration. But here, the two main bodies of the 20th century that established international legitimacy and legality recognized the Jewish state and the rights of the Jewish people to reestablish that state. So if you're going to wage what I call this total war against Israel, you have to figure out a way to undercut that fact. And that is the new anti-Zionism. It's to undercut our very legitimacy. And it does it operates like the old anti-Semitism. And because people aren't certain how to relate to it, what it exactly is, it's much harder to fight. But it's something we have to fight because the spillover from anti-Zionism into anti-Semitism is clear. I'll stop here and we'll go on.
Thank you very much. Let me ask now, let's come back a little bit to the definition and the protest and the pushback you hear. This is undermining free speech. This is just an attempt to shut down legitimate discussion or criticism of Israel. Now, when somebody says death to Israel, etc., that's clear. But let's take the BDS movement. They want to boycott, divest from Israel. Obviously, we are against it. But, boycotts are a legitimate tool in international diplomacy. We are all here probably in the room, or many of us probably in favor of sanctioning Iran. Why would you say to somebody who says, well, look, you're just trying to shut down a debate. We are just against certain policies of Israel and therefore want to boycott it. How would you counter that argument? Whoever wants to take this.
It's good that you clarified in the beginning that your questions are just don't necessarily reflect your opinion.
Exactly. Gerald.
The question is extremely important, and we all encounter it almost every day in different venues, on campuses, in churches, and elsewhere. And I think the standards that we talked about earlier are the same ones that we should apply here. First of all, the issue of singling out. Who else are you boycotting? And that's one of the techniques that I and others use. China has long ago invaded and ethnically cleansed and other terrible things to Tibet. Are you boycotting Chinese televisions, Chinese phones, Chinese technology? No. And you go through the list and you show how much, the degree to which the focus on Israel is singling out, using double standards, and in most cases the standards themselves are not at all precise. When the head of the academic group, one of the first academic groups to boycott Israel as a professional group, the Society of Studies of American Politics, something like that, was asked, and he said, well, you have to start somewhere. There are lots of problems in the world, you have to start somewhere. Part of the reason, an important part of the reason that these boycott movements focus on Israel is that there's so much money, so much PR, so much manipulation behind the BDS movement. And if you get people to stop long enough to say, well, why is there so much noise about it? Why are there so many groups demonstrating against Israel? Why are groups that are on the fringes of the Jewish community, Jewish Voice for Peace, and if not now, why do they have the ability to hire PR firms to get articles in major newspapers? There's also that aspect. It's in a way an economic aspect. In any war, each element of the fighting forces has to have the resources to be able to get on the battlefield. This battlefield is in a lot of ways artificial. That's not necessarily an intellectual argument, which is different, but it's also a matter of why are we focusing so much emphasis, so much attention on boycotting Israel and attacking Israel. The last point that I want to make on this round is the role of the churches in this. That gets us back to the early question of the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and the history. One of the major elements pushing this forward outside in the UN, Dore knows more about this than I do, so I'll make it brief, on the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is a big engine behind this in the UN Human Rights Council. But also what you have in this entire process, a large amount of money, at least 150 million euros, dollars, pounds a year, going into this engine that tells you to boycott Israel constantly. And that process raises the visibility and tends to bring people into, without even thinking about whether or not this has the moral criteria, whether this is fair, whether this is right. You can object, and there's part of objecting to the occupation is very different, and suggesting other policies is very different than saying I'm going to boycott Israeli products. The churches very much are part of this. A lot of the money comes from churches. I'll just mention the World Council of Churches, which has a very strong emphasis on, they send groups over, a group called Ecumenical Accompaniment Program for Palestinians in Israel. And that's a very strong propaganda process, but the worst part of it is that when they leave the area, you have hundreds of young people who've been indoctrinated to repeat the Palestinian narrative, and with that BDS movement, and it gets absorbed in the churches and continues there and accelerates, and it's very hard, because it's a closed framework, it's very hard to get in and oppose that. So you have all these elements together, which I think have created what we see out in the real world.
Dore.
Since we're mentioning each other, Gerald, your writings on the origins of BDS and the books you've put out at NGO Monitor, always point to a fundamental fact that we have to keep in mind. This whole BDS movement has its origins with the desire of those who advocate for it to replicate the playbook of South Africa. Israel as an apartheid state is the false lie that they put out. And since the international campaign against South Africa involved boycott, divestment, sanctions, and it ultimately brought down the South African regime, that's what they're trying to do. That's the name of the game. What is outrageous about all of this is A, Israel's not an apartheid state. B, I go to South Africa quite a bit lately, and you ask people, tell me, in the days of apartheid South Africa, could blacks and whites go to the same hospital? You had black hospitals and white hospitals. All the characteristics of the apartheid regime don't apply here. But it's a lie that goes out. I have to tell you, I was Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I took our delegations to meet in Pretoria with the South African Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We signed agreements, we did things, and then I decided, you know what I have to do? I have to acknowledge some of the narrative of the other side. And I went to a farm outside of Johannesburg, which had been the training ground of the military branch of the ANC, the African National Congress. And lo and behold, I receive a different piece of history than I would receive if I walked the halls of the UN, whether in Geneva or in New York. Israelis, Jews, many of them communists, were training the ANC to fight the apartheid regime. See, that completely defies the narrative which they're selling that we're the same as South Africa. And some of those guys who I fundamentally disagree with, not because they fought the apartheid regime, I disagree with them because they are hard left-wing ideologues, members of the Communist Party. They wanted to see me as the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we found a way of communicating one with the other. So what I'm trying to say is they're trying to push us into the corner of being apartheid South Africa. And the fact is there's a huge amount of evidence to that the exact opposite is true. But that's the battlefield we're on, and that's what we have to understand.
Simone, part of that definition includes a reference to the idea of holding Jews collectively responsible for Israeli policies, real or very often imagined. You live in the European country that has the biggest Jewish community. Talk a little bit about the repercussions of that mechanism.
Sure. Where to start? The repercussion of that are then, for example, in 2014, when you had the war between Gaza, Hamas, and Israel, you had for month and month demonstrations in the streets of Paris, attacking Jews, attacking synagogues. We honestly came very, very close of having a massacre of Jews who were hiding in a synagogue in the middle of Paris. And that's the association that is being made. Another example of it is when Mohamed Merah, I don't know if that name rings a bell to you, one of the first severe terrorist attacks in France in 2012, a Frenchman who had been brought up in France went into a Jewish school and killed 3 tiny little Jewish school children and a teacher. And what was his reasoning when the police found him? He was avenging the Palestinians. So that's how things get confounded. That's how Jews are being held responsible for an imagined action of the Israeli government. Again, it has nothing to do with reality. It's pure anti-Semitism, and it's really this obsessive nature of where old anti-Semitism becomes conflated with new anti-Semitism, with old stereotypes, with basically the Zionist conspiracy, the Jews try to control the world, the idea of always looking for the moral flaw amongst the Jews, which is actually an old age phenomenon in reality and goes over now as the moral flaw being the Zionist Jewish state. And again, so the idea is, of course, then to hold all Jews responsible. Unfortunately, the reality is that the anti-Semitism that started with this conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and holding Jews responsible for the actions of Israel or for imagined actions of Israel have actually now become separated and inherent. They are so deep-rooted, that have become so deep-rooted over the years that independent of anything that's going on in Israel or independent of anything that's going on in Gaza or wherever, there is deep-rooted anti-Semitism. And that has, as was mentioned earlier on, provoked the murder of 11 Jews since 2006.
Now, just briefly, if you can add a few words about, I mean, you're preparing another conference in a few months that talks not just about anti-Semitism, but about the general problem of radicalism and promoting, I know you're promoting the working definition. If you can talk a little bit about what your office is specifically doing and maybe also about this conference, I think this would be quite interesting.
You mean the wake-up call?
Yes.
Yeah. So again, the idea is more generally that anti-Semitism is, as Düzen earlier said, is not a problem just for Jews. It's a problem for the entire society. It's a problem for democracy, and it's the first sign of a symptom of something that profoundly affects our democracy. That it's in English you have this fantastic, I think, expression called the canary in the coal mine, or the canary in the coal mine, depending on if you're American or British. But it's really this. It's the idea that it starts with a Jew. But it certainly doesn't end there. So what we are looking at is we're looking at the deeper phenomenon that actually then lead to anti-Semitism or provoke anti-Semitism as the first symptom of it. So of course the issue of radicalization of Islamist movements that exist across Europe and that have been growing over the years that can express themselves violently, so in jihadism, but not only. that you see all kinds of Salafist movements, you see all sort of separatist movements, you see all sorts of Muslim Brotherhood kind of movements that exist across Europe, and that lead then to, of course, jihadist radicalization. And on the other hand, the issue of the radicalization of the political spectrum, that again is of which is the symptom, of which anti-Semitism is the first symptom. The radicalization, of course, on the left, perfectly illustrated with the UK and Jeremy Corbyn, where you have more and more sort of the anti-imperialist, anti-American, anti-capitalist movements that take over the Labour Party in the UK, and with it comes, of course, the idea of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, etc. And then on the other end of the spectrum, of course, more populist, right-wing, extreme right-wing neo-Nazi movements that in response to it, and also to the fact that some of the traditional moderate parties don't deal with those issues, respond to it, and then you have the Front National, of course, in France, you have the AfD in Germany, and with it comes, of course, anti-Semitism. So the idea, again, at le sursaut, as we say in French or in English, the wake-up call, is to look at all of those phenomena and really look at it from a sort of more global perspective.
Very good. Düzen, Simone just referenced it, and you also the Islamist, the Middle Eastern angle. Just yesterday was the so-called Al-Quds Day in Berlin, which was invented by the Islamic Republic of Iran as an really bloodthirsty anti-Zionist demonstration on the streets of Berlin, 1,500 people. Talk a little bit about what you hear. We have, over the last 3 years, more than 1 million people, mostly from the Middle East, with Muslim background, have come to Germany and Austria and Sweden. What is it that you're hearing? What you're experiencing? With what sort of ideas have they been brought up?
I think what the people have to understand, especially in Europe, is that what is happening in Mosul or in Raqqa is not so far away from Berlin as they think, because it's the same pictures of enemies. And we have the same influence. So, for example, there was a time when Erdogan was called ISIS light, but we could put the light off. I don't see any light anymore, because what he's doing is the same. And he has an idea with this, what he's doing. And the result is that we have people in Germany from Turkey who was born and raised there, but they don't feel belong to Germany or to democracy. They say, in their opinion, to be a good Muslim means to be against Jewish people, means to be against Yazidi people. And this is something which is very dangerous for all of us. But we have to put off this influence. So our mosques are, not all of them, but some of them are hijacked with this influence, are paid from Saudi Arabia, from Turkey. And then this is the result, and this is the reason for growing up, for example, ISIS. So when we talk about Mosul, I went there a few weeks ago together with the development minister, and we were talking about rebuild of the city, but what is with the rebuilding of the human beings there? Our women have been slaved in the souk markets, and now they are all talking about forgiving. And what someone said to me, who is an ISIS survivor, said, how can I forgive when I don't get justice? How can I forgive when no one is interested in what happened to me? So when I think about a Holocaust survivor, which I met in Miami last year, and I said to him, yes, it's very important that we talk to each other, what happened? And he said, no, that it happened. That it happened. And this was a lesson for me. And this is maybe the reason for my work, to go there, to these places, and to talk concrete about what is happening to our people, that we have so many child soldiers who don't come back anymore because they feel they have the right religion right now. So the problem is, I think, that the secular Muslims have to distance themselves from the ISIS. And I don't see that. And when I see that, the people are threatened by themselves. So that will be a big, big challenge. Of course it will be. And it will be a challenge of our values as well. For example, I wrote a book about 2 years ago with the title Germany Under Siege, why we have to fight for our values. Then they called me a populist. So 3 years after, everything what I have write in the book happened. So I think we need a new culture of discussion, for example, and we have to talk to everyone, especially to the people, to the liberal Muslims, who have to stand up and say, not in my name. But I don't see that, and I want to see that. And one last thing, maybe in Mosul, there was just about 3,000 ISIS fighters. This is not so much. It was the part of the Sunni Muslim population in Mosul who took our women as slaves. And when we talked to them, it was like, no, they are not human beings, they are slaves. We can behave them in that way. And that is the real tragedy, and we have to talk about that.
Okay, at this stage, I would like to open it up to the audience. Do we have enough microphones? Because we also need them here. We want to collect 3 to 5 questions. Please, everybody, keep it short and really 2 questions. And I encourage you to ask our experts a little bit about what are the best strategies to counter. But these are your questions.
Not influencing whatsoever.
Yes, good morning. Like your opinions about Nikki Haley, please. Over the past year, she seems to have been center stage in trying to defend the state of Israel from the unfairness within the United Nations. Couple of questions. Given that she was governor of South Carolina and maybe not necessarily having the greatest background, but to what extent do you believe her Indian American Sikh background has influenced her belief of what fairness is? Do we know if AJC has been tutoring her? And then also, has she been effective at all in convincing other nations within the United Nations to treat Israel better?
Thanks. My question is actually prompted in part by a Commentary magazine article this month in which the following is said: intersectionality needs to be understood first as a model of political organizing, second as a conspiracy, and only third as a theory. So my question is, how is intersectionality being used or abused when it comes to Zionism, anti-Israel, and anti-Semitism?
Parallel over the last 30 years that I've been watching things is at the same time that anti-Zionism began was also anti-settlements. Is that an excuse, a rationalization, or just a reason?
Hi, so I am a student at American University in Washington, D.C. I do consider myself very progressive and very much a leftist. And I'm also very proudly and very happily a Zionist. And I don't see those two things as incompatible. In fact, I see them very, very much compatible and not mutually exclusive. And I was wondering, to push back on that definition of intersectionality, I do think the definition has been very bastardized by the left because it is not meant to be a weaponized model. It is supposed to be a theoretical framework to look at compounding oppressions. But is there hope for the left? Is there hope for young Zionists like myself who are also progressive? And what does that look like?
And the shy lady here in the front row.
Hi, my question is about BDS. I would like to ask 2 questions. First of all, how much damage did BDS did to Israel? Because when you see all the success in technology, in tourism, etc., you wonder. And the other question is, how much did the American Jewish press and the Israeli press help the BDS by putting it more on the map?
Let's take 2 more here on this side, and then we close.
I'm not going to remember anything.
Yeah, I've got it all. I'm a professional moderator.
Hi, my name is Serena, and I have the following question. How can you engage? It's a practical... Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, I think it's me in the microphone. So my question that I have is a practical one. How do you engage with a Jewish person that holds anti-Zionist ressentiments?
All right, let's keep it now. Let's close it now. Let's see if we can have time for a second round. All right, so Nikki Haley. I'm not based in New York. I don't think that you can say that AJC has been tutoring. We are of course all great fans and friends of her. But maybe Dore, what do you think about to what extent she has perhaps had already an impact in her relatively short but quite dynamic tenure?
When I was Israel's ambassador to the UN, I was struck with the fact that international diplomacy had lost all standards. There were no standards. It had all collapsed. The standards set forward originally in the UN Charter were no longer being applied. This was not a problem of Israel. This was the problem of the whole UN system. And to create what the founding fathers of the United Nations originally had in mind, you have to have very strong diplomats who reassert standards. That is to Israel's advantage. It's also to the advantage of a stable international order, because we're basically in a world where world order has collapsed. So Nikki Haley is an incredible asset. And the fact that she comes from a family of Indian immigrants, happen to be Sikh, is maybe tells us something about how the structure of the world is changing. For us today, you know, it used to be Israeli diplomats just wanted to go to New York, Los Angeles, London, the classic centers of power. Today, we have to have a much broader sense of how the world system has changed. My think tank, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, has a sister think tank in New Delhi. And that's the kind of outreach we have to employ. So that's not an answer about Nikki Haley. That's an answer that's a little broader. But I think she's great. And again, I think our approach should be pointing out that more pro-Israel line is really a line of standards. And an international system that has no standards will collapse.
I'll just add very quickly, in addition to the standards that she brings back to some degree into the UN system, the actions that she's taken in the last year and a half have also been ones that we have not seen for decades. The American refusal to allow even a discussion in the UN Security Council that was extremely one-sided, and to force on the members of the Security Council a discussion about the Hamas violations of and war crimes was something we have not seen any time that I can remember. The other specific thing that I want to raise is the decision to freeze the funding for UNRWA, which is also largely unthinkable. And it sets in motion a process of re-examining how this institution, which has kept the conflict going for almost 70 years, how we can wind that down. And what's really amazing is that the Swiss foreign minister followed up on that recently. I don't think he would have opened his mouth or said it had he not already had Nikki Haley setting the way.
And it's important to point out that the Swiss consider themselves as a custodian of all these international organizations and laws, so that's a really significant step. Maybe we can combine the question about whether intersectionality has been used and abused with the question about the lady who considers herself being from the left and whether there is still hope for her in the left. I would imagine, from my point of view, I would hope that you are our hope, that you as a person on the left can help bring about that change there. But maybe who wants to tackle that? First of all, also maybe for the benefit of the audience, not everybody may know what intersectionality really is. I think the left is confused, but let's give everybody wants to give a sort of very short standard definition of it.
Me?
Yeah.
I don't know if I can get a definition of intersectionality, but the idea is that different groups, minority groups, come together and bring causes together and act on behalf of them. To go back to I agree with the fact that it's exactly that. It's the fact of taking the cause and the issue back. Manuel Valls, when he was prime minister, spoke about the two irreconcilable lefts. And I think this is very much true. I think today we see a left that is drifting away from the very values it's supposed to be standing for, such as feminism, for example. And making alliances, for example, with Islamists. It's something that is very present. It's definitely very present, again, in the typical example of Jeremy Corbyn, who has called members of Hamas and Hezbollah my friends. And at the same time, the left is, again, supposed to be standing for gay rights, women's rights, etc., etc. How is that compatible with movements who hang gays out of windows? When Linda Sarsour says that you cannot be a Zionist and a feminist, again, it's the incarnation of that very sick abuse of intersectionality. But I think it's really up to the left to gain the power back and to have the courage to have that debate, to confront those who are abusing the very ideals of progressiveness of the left, and to gain those values back. Unfortunately, I don't think it's happening enough. But because we are all hopeful, we can maybe try and hope some more. We can see certain elements already happening. That being said, again, when I speak about Manuel Valls, France is a typical example where you really do have those two irreconcilable lefts, and where you have a very strong debate on those issues, where you have sort of a more social democratic left that is trying to gain back those values, and we're basically telling people you cannot at the same time defend gay rights, women's rights, etc., and make alliances with Islamists and accuse a democratic state such as Israel of crimes that don't exist.
I luckily never studied sociology, but I believe that one concept of intersectionality is the idea that all forms of oppression are somehow connected. So you can't discuss homophobia without discussing other forms of racism or misogyny. But they are now more and more making the point that Jews are not an oppressed minority, can never be understood as such because they are white and are therefore, by definition, the oppressor. And it does not only apply to Israel as a colonial power, but every single Jew, even living in the United States. So that makes it almost impossible for them they created intellectual blockade to even see Jews, or let alone Israel, also as a potential victim.
For example, in certain universities, Jewish students who want to join the Black Lives Matter movement are either asked to sign a statement where they will say that they are not Zionists, or refused altogether.
How much damage has BDS so far done to the state of Israel? Very good question. And to what extent is the media, maybe also Gerald, responsible for fueling this whole industry by keeping a spotlight on it that perhaps otherwise not too many people would pay attention to?
I'm not going to take responsibility at the beginning, maybe at the end. That's a very important question that does not get asked enough in Israel. It's a really important Israeli question. There's no tangible economic damage to Israel. Now, there might be, if the UN Human Rights Council goes ahead and publishes a blacklist which includes banks, we have scenarios where there could be some damage, but there are also ways of countering that.
Explain the blacklist.
The UN Human Rights Council, about 2 years ago, in its inevitable ways of condemning Israel, as the next step in the BDS movement adopted, was essentially a campaign by NGOs, all of our favorite NGOs, to form a list, a database of companies that are assisting the occupation. And that, in practice, means they're looking for ways of hampering Israeli banks and also of frightening multinationals from doing work, because every Israeli bank has branches in Ma'ale Adumim and Efrat and in the Golan Heights and elsewhere. And so this is a campaign that's now focused in the Human Rights Council. There's a lot of effort, and we've been involved in that. Obviously, the Israeli government is very involved in this to try to, so far, delay it, but it may happen at any month. So if that happens, then the claim that there's no economic damage has to be reassessed. But I think that even then, it will be limited. The main damage is psychological, reputational, political. And I'll illustrate that with a couple of my students. And my students have many counterparts. But I know of at least 2 students from my university who graduated their first degree and went to universities in the UK, Bradford, and I forgot what the other one was, and were told by their professors that because they were Israelis, they were asked, "Did you serve in the Israeli army?" They said yes, they were proud of that. And then they were told, "You cannot study in my class, you're a war criminal." And that's a form, it's a very tangible form of BDS. And we see it in many different ways. It's that labeling, that very pejorative labeling. And I think also it has an impact. People who do not have the personality to deal with that will say, well, maybe there's something wrong with me and with us. And they become the Jewish voices for peace, the ones who want to end the occupation because they can't handle this kind of stigmatization. Somebody asked, this talked about the coincidence between the timing of the process of Zionism becoming a form of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism merging, having to do with the occupation. But the language is used that Israel itself is an apartheid state. When Dore talked about that, it wasn't the occupation. So any of the occupation is not going to change that because Israel stigmatized. And the students who are going to travel, even if there is no occupation, let's say there's a 2-state solution, will still have to deal with the allegation that Israel was formed in sin and is by definition an apartheid state, which is why it's important to fight against these concepts. Does the media, does the public debate in some ways amplify the virulence of the BDS process? I think in many cases there's not enough caution, and the headlines that are given, and I'll say this carefully, sometimes the actions of the Israeli government, my own government, are ones which give headlines and visibility to what otherwise would be a very minor and not important particular activity in the BDS world.
We have one last question. How do you engage Jewish anti-Zionists, which reminds me of the Austrian Jewish journalist, writer, turn of the century, who wrote under the pen name Roda, who said, anti-Semitism could really become something if only the Jews applied themselves to it. So who wants to take this? How do you engage Jewish anti-Zionists?
I think the biggest problem we have in the Jewish world is ignorance. In order to defend the state of Israel, you've got to know your rights. You've got to know your history. If someone says, you know, the Israeli presence here in Jerusalem is a spin-off of European colonialism, well, guess what? We had a Jewish majority in Jerusalem by the middle of the 19th century. Baghdad was an Arab city. Damascus was an Arab city. Cairo was an Arab city. Jerusalem in the mid-19th century was a Jewish city. We have to educate ourselves. We have to get out there with the fundamental factoids about our history. And then I think we have a chance of starting to push back. But without that education, without that history, it's just not going to work.
I think in times like today, being minority is part of solution, especially in Europe. So many politicians, for example, are asking the Jewish community or the Yazidi what is happening in the region and how can we stand up against that. Because what we have in common is that we survived. We survived many genocides, not just one. And I think this kind of abstainer mentality is something which is very, very important. And we are always talking about why so many people hate the Jewish people. But I will tell you that there are many people in the world who are loving you for what you are doing. For example, our Yazidi community. You are like, for us, like role models because you build up something on ruins, on something which is unspeakable and uncurbable. And therefore, this is something which we have to go on, follow on, together and loud.
We have 50 more minutes, so we have time for a shorter second round. Over there, the lady. Where are the microphones?
Hi. So as a current college student in a community where anti-Semitism is and anti-Zionism is very big and becoming even more popular among students, administration, and teachers, I'm curious how you guys suggest we show and sort of engage these people, but also show how these people, the anti-Semitism and the anti-Zionism community is actually anti-Semitism.
Hello, my name is Jonas Zenou. I'm a part of the French Union of Jewish Students, and I'm the president of the local chapter in the La Sorbonne. Like Simone Rodan said, 3 months ago, our office in La Sorbonne was destroyed, and with encryptions of anti-Zionism aspect and anti-Semitism. Our government was really helpful, and the politicians also, because they really understood that, but the problem was with the other associations of the university who did not want to get involved with the problem because they didn't actually see the anti-Semitism part, and I just wanted to know how can we make them understand, because it's really difficult for them to understand that.
Hi, my name's Hannah. I'm the president of the Union of Jewish Students in the UK and Ireland, and I'm also a member of the UK Labour Party. My question to you is, it's been said a lot today that one of the issues with anti-Zionism is that they hold Israel to a different standard to a lot of different countries, a lot of different issues around the world. One perspective that I was hoping I could get your opinions on, that I've heard both on campus and in the party, is that, well, we say that Israel is a beacon of democracy in the Middle East. We hold ourselves to a different standard. And that, of course, if we say we're a beacon of democracy, then we should be treated as such. And that is why Israel is shown to be different to lots of different countries. And that's why the BDS movement looks specifically at Israel, and why the far left and lots of other anti-Zionists specifically treat Israel in this way. I was hoping you could respond to that.
I'd like to ask if there's any organization in the anti-BDS or anti-approach which is taking funds and using these funds to support the anti-BDS movement. The BDS movement is well funded, and as much as we have a philosophy of combating that, I don't think we can succeed unless we also have similar funding on our side.
I'm afraid that we have to give it over now to the panel to stay within the time limit. What? One more? Okay.
Hi everyone. I'm Adela from Mexico. I'm board member of the Latin American Young Jewish Federation. And we want to share an experience that have passed recently in Chile, in the Chilean Federation. There was one Jewish guy who was running for a position in the campus. And the Palestinian community and the BDS movement, it's so hard and so he was pushing for him to quit and to get out of the elections. But well, at the end, the push, it was not too hard, and he luckily won the elections. But we want to ask you about how do you see the rise of the anti-Zionism and the BDS also in Latin America?
So, Colin, so how do you, there were several questions, particularly on campus, how do you engage these people? There was a question also, not just about those who advocate BDS, but how do you get other student associations who are not anti-Zionist, who are not anti-Semitic, but how do you get them to show solidarity with them? Maybe we take those two questions together. Coalition building.
Well, I haven't been active on campus since the 1970s. So I'm not going to pretend that I have knowledge of what's going to work, but I'll tell you from the diplomatic world what I think applies almost everywhere. In 2015, I had engaged in a, you could say, a back-channel, secret dialogue with a think tank from Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And the head of the think tank was General Anwar Eshki from the Saudi military intelligence. We used to meet in Rome rather frequently. My team, his team. It's a great story. It's not for now. But we spoke at the time that the Iran agreement was moving along and was going to be concluded. And we both agreed that if an Israeli team went to Washington and spoke about the problems of the Iran agreement, or a Saudi team went, that would be one thing. But if we went together and spoke publicly against it, we could have much greater impact. And it's bravery on his part. But we went to Washington, we set up a press conference at the Council on Foreign Relations, and we trashed the Iran agreement. He did it in Arabic with a translator. I'm telling you that story because I believe that we can find allies, people who will work with us in the Arab and Islamic worlds, who don't accept the zeitgeist that you're hearing from the Muslim Brotherhood. And therefore, it reminds me of just one other fact, a story. I'm sitting in New York with a prince from one of the royal families in the Gulf, and we're deciding on where we should have our next meeting. So I say, well, it's easier than to go to New York. Why don't we just meet in Paris or in Rome or in London? It's closer to the Middle East. And so he turns to me, he comes from a religious society, and he says, there are a bunch of Muslim extremists in Europe. It's not safe there. We'll either meet in the Persian Gulf or we'll meet in New York. So why am I telling you that? Because there are people who are very reasonable out there who have many of our concerns. And I don't know whether you can pull this off on a campus. But if you can lock arm in arm with Muslims, because not all Muslims are extremists, big mistake to think that, and give them a little courage and have them come out with you, it'll be good for the struggle against Islamism, and it'll be good for the Jewish people, and it will help us win this struggle.
Yeah, if I entirely agree, and there's not so much to add, and it's one of the things that I think AJC has been trying to do across the world, certainly in Europe. And by the way, one of the things that we have also done is to take Muslim leaders to Israel and have them see the realities, the very complex realities. I think one thing that we all can say here when we're here in Israel is that Israel is certainly not black and white. It's different shades of gray, and once you understand the extremely complex situation and the extremely complex realities that Israelis face with, you never come back in the same way. So absolutely creating alliances, of course, with Muslims, but also with people of common interests, people who share the same values, people who, for example, have been combating Islamist extremism, because often it goes hand in hand together, especially on the left. I think this is one of the things. And again, I think the fact, and I know that the Union of Jewish Students in France is doing this quite a bit, is taking as many people to this region and seeing the realities for themselves is absolutely crucial. Because you can certainly talk about Israel, you can certainly try and explain Israel, you can certainly try and explain Zionism, you can certainly try and explain when when anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitism, but there is nothing better than actually seeing things on the ground for oneself.
We come to the next question. The young student in Ireland who said that
UK and Ireland.
UK, Ireland, but your question was that the BDS movement, that we ourselves, or Israelis consider themselves, they are a democracy, so they should be held to a different standard, and that explains the BDS movement, right?
We've heard this for about 20 years. It was actually stated back in the Durban NGO Forum that Israel, exactly the same language that you had. In my view, that's exactly part of the problem. That's a theme that the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic camp uses. As an Israeli, my first response is, I can hold myself to higher standards. Israelis should hold Israel to a higher standard. But that's an internal decision. It's not for people who are obsessively what that becomes is a form of obsession, and I see that, for instance, among people in Human Rights Watch who are obsessively always attacking Israel, always accusing Israel of violating international law, of committing war crimes, and the scale of those attacks have nothing to do with any kind of normal assessment of what's going on. So this difference between holding oneself to a higher standard and obsessing about Israel from the outside is, I think, very important. I want to take a quick point about Latin America. Oh, yeah, I think that's NGO monitoring. It also has to do with are there funds going to fight BDS? The answer is yes. Are they always effective? Like anything else, sometimes yes, sometimes no, and I'll give a plug for AJC. I'm sitting here in a panel in a 2,400 people here. That's an amazing event. And Daniel and I go back many years, the Transatlantic Institute, the Berlin branch, and the other branches of the AJC, among other organizations. Those are extremely important parts of the process of fighting this. And everything that we do in Brussels is coordinated, the same thing in Berlin. In Latin America, we do not have enough of an infrastructure collectively. And NGO Monitor, a year ago, with the coordination of the ambassadors in the foreign ministry, I think it might have even started while you were still there, and now has become a major project. We did our first report, and unfortunately we were not surprised when the pressure on the Argentinian football team to cancel their friendly match here became great. The BDS movement in Latin America has established a strong foothold, and we need to work together. So I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards about, because we really would like to expand the beginnings of the work that we did there.
Just to complete that, we also have representations in Latin America. We have a Latino Institute, but no doubt much more work needs to be done. It's also, in certain countries, such as Chile, with such a big Palestinian community, a particularly very difficult battlefield. I'm afraid we've run out of time. But the good news is now we can have lunch. And thank you all very much for your interest. And a round of applause for the panel.